Don't you know, can't you hear, won't you see? Gene here alive in a living color right here on the YouTube, presenting Gene Has Concerns, Dark Side of the Ring, the Jeff Jarrett and TNA story. And wow, what a story this is. And boy, do I have some concerns, but I've also got a little additional things for you. So, definitely, this was a great episode. The opening little montage was awesome with the sound bites from all the talking heads there and everything. And let me give you a little bit of background first of who I am. As I used to, back in 1984, started as a ring crew, and then, excuse me, did the refereeing, and then became a manager in 86 as a Fabulous Fritzy. Have managed throughout the years underneath the different names. And as you can see behind me over here with the technical alchemist, David Mercury, and that's 2 E's on D. You can find him on Facebook. Was working with him. I was his assistant for many years up until last year, where I've had to pull back a little bit. But mainly worked independents and everything, or only worked independents, but really I got some background and some knowledge, learning from the great Malenko and many other greats throughout the years and such. So, and like I said, I'll be adding a few things to this. This isn't necessarily a how do I word this? This isn't a lot more like a review show as a companion show, I hope, because of some of the things that I've looked up and been able to add to this. So, but wow, what a great array of talking heads they had. Of course, Jeff Jarrett, they had Jim Cornette, who I really, really appreciate because he's also a manager. Scott D'Amore, Vince Russo, and we'll talk about him a little later. James Mitchell, who I also really like. Scott Steiner, David Sahadi, who I don't even remember if I've ever seen him on video before. If I had, I didn't pay attention. Matt Hardy, Jeff Hardy, D'Lo Brown, and of course the narrator, Chris Jericho, but he didn't give me feedback. He's just narrating. And like I said before, the opening was fantastic. Lots of credible people. It really makes you feel like, you know, it's going to be a big time documentary. And Jeff says today he views TNA differently than he did back in 2002. And, you know, that's probably the best description I've ever heard of TNA. Because, you know, I wasn't always watching through the years. I'd watch and then lose interest. Russo years, I really lost interest. The Hulk Hogan and Bischoff years, really, really lost interest. I don't know if that was years or a year. But anyway, and then it just never picked it back up, except little bits here and there, and kind of reading about it, watching some of the videos on social media and stuff like that, but just never really dug back into it. But for the company, you know, Jeff wanted something different, alternative, not WWE, not WCW. Hopes for the wrestlers and hopes for his own family because, you know, with the purchase of WCW, he's kind of out of work, you know. And this is something younger fans probably don't understand. When WCW died, there was nowhere else to work. And that's kind of when the independents kind of really exploded. There were already independents in the 90s, but this kind of, you know, where, you know, people started putting on shows and guys and gals started getting work from it. So, and by the way, if I look over here on this side, I'm also streaming live on TikTok as I'm recording. So they're getting a raw firsthand viewing of Gene Has Concerns. So, but growing up, Jeff Jarrett, he was the son of Jerry Jarrett, professional wrestler, grandson of Teenie Jarrett. So it was a family business. And of course, he learned a lot when he started staying with his dad, watching tapes. Teenie gave him a job selling concessions, and then he refereed, learned marketing. He was a ring crew, and then he started wrestling. And a little bit of side bit on Teenie Jarrett. After divorce, she needed a way to support her family. And she, you know, I believe it was a shoe store she was working at. But basically she started selling tickets for promoters Nick Goulas and Roy Welch. I believe when Roy went into the store, and they were selling tickets for the Hippodrome in Nashville. And she impressed them enough that she was given more responsibilities. And eventually she became the what we call local promoter in a lot of these towns across Tennessee and Kentucky. And years later, when Jerry Jarrett launched his CWA, Buddy Fuller, which was the son of Roy Welch, um, he helped Jerry out a lot and Teenie out in their new promotion that was television was done in Memphis. So, and Jeff didn't just grow up around one wrestling promoter. He grew up watching one of the most successful women in wrestling history, and Teenie Jarrett earned her place in the business from the ground up. So. And then, of course, Jeff became a wrestler. He started tag team with his father. I think he was attacked by Bill Dundee and somebody else as a referee, and that kind of stirred everything up to him becoming a wrestler. And it really explains why Jeff understands the business so much as he does. He's not just a fly-by-night promoter. He was brought up in the business and brought up by two promoters with his grandmother and then Jerry, that he just kind of gets it, I think. So, and then throughout his career, he worked in Memphis and probably went a few other places, but then, he got to WWF and he got this Double J Jeff Jarrett gimmick, who was a country singer. And this was kind of the Attitude Era. And that rolled into his Pissed Off Jeff Jarrett and Don't Piss Me Off. And then he had the guitar and using that a lot. But I really liked Jeff and the Double J character when he came on the scene. I really enjoyed what he was doing with the country music bit and everything. And then I think it was found out that Road Dogg was supposed to be the one actually singing instead of him, kind of like Milli Vanilli type thing. But Jeff really was great at his character work. He could definitely get himself across and get himself over, which some people in the wrestling business they can't get those fans to get behind them, whether they're a good guy or a bad guy, and Jeff really got that. And he really encompasses that type of wrestler that can, turn it on and keep the people into what he's doing. So, and of course I love the character. My wife at the time, she didn't like the character. She hated Jeff Jarrett, and hey, what a mark, right? So anyway, then we get across Owen Hart, who was also a son of a legendary wrestler. And he, they kind of bonded together over that. And Jeff explains that Owen wasn't just another wrestler. He was his best friend. And we've all heard the stories of Owen Hart and being a ribber, but being a good guy. And he wasn't a drinker, he wasn't a smoker, as Jeff says in this. And, it was such a tragedy when Owen passed away in Kansas City. But this is where the documentary kind of slows down a little bit and Jeff, really telling the story. And that worked for me. Jeff kind of lets the fans see a side of him that, people don't get to see. And he kind of had survivor's guilt through all that. And we'll see throughout the documentary that, that kind of stuck with him a lot and didn't play well for him. And it kind of becomes a pattern in his life. But then he leaves WWE. And the story was that he held Vince up for money. Well, he kind of did, but not in the way that the story was ever told from what he's saying and what I've heard from other sources as well. That he was owed money already. So give me that money up front and I'll drop the title to China on pay-per-view, even though I don't have a contract anymore, as it ended the day before is what I remember. And then he came back and said, "Oh, give me a little bit more, a lot more, like twice as much more." So Vince paid him. And I think he had to have the building, if I remember correctly, write the check. Someone correct me on this, come in the comments and let me know. I think Vince asked the company or someone asked the company and the company covered the check and then Vince got him right back something like that. There was something to do where money didn't come from Vince right away or something. I don't remember exactly. Somebody correct me on that if I'm wrong. But Vince paid him. He lost to China. And the very next night, he's on WCW. So, and, that's leverage. Whether you agree with it or not, Jeff knew exactly when he held the cards. So I think he played that nicely. He's with WCW. He's getting over, like I said earlier. And then WCW dies. We go through the Vince Russo era with WCW. Eric Bischoff can't get it purchased through what he was doing, and ends up that through the AOL and Time Warner merger. Funny how TBS TNT has wrestling again, but through that, they didn't want wrestling on their TV networks anymore, and that kind of ruined the funding and partnership that Eric Bischoff was working on, and thus Vince McMahon ended up buying all the assets and buying some contracts. He did not buy the AOL Time Warner Turner contracts that Hulk Hogan and Sting and many of the other guys had, but he did bring some WCW guys on board, and he fired Jeff Jarrett live on Raw that night when the announcement was made. So this is probably the biggest turning point of the documentary, and it was one of the biggest turning points in wrestling because, again, like I said earlier, you were done. If you didn't get picked up at WWE, there wasn't any place else to go. You can go to Japan. You can go to Mexico maybe. Some guys did. Some guys were successful, but there wasn't a lot of work out there. So thank goodness for some independence. And I'm sure back then the guys weren't asking for an exorbitant amount of money. At least most of them probably weren't, or some today that surely do. But, and they get booked. I don't understand it. I don't know how the promoters make money sometimes booking some of the talent, but they do. Anyway, that's a side note. That's one of my other concerns. But if Vince McMahon hadn't publicly humiliated Jeff, would Jeff have even started TNA? So that's something to keep in mind. Excuse me. So, starting TNA, Jeff makes an interesting point. He didn't just want another wrestling company. He wanted something different. He was going after the country music audience, the NASCAR fans, WCW audience, the Southern wrestling fans down there. And, he went to his dad, Jerry, and they started together. And I actually never thought about him targeting NASCAR fans, but that actually, that was a smart move. It was a smart thing to do. And hold on a second, I gotta fix something over here real quick. I got to go on Do Not Disturb over there. Okay. Anyway. And, it just kind of made perfect sense because it is the same demographic. Now he needs funding to get it all started. Richard Scrushy is a friend of his, and thus they get into bed together, so to speak. Jeff gives him his business presentation. He gets funding. It's a huge break. Everything looks great. And one thing I noticed, Jeff doesn't really present himself as a wrestler here. He presents himself as an entrepreneur. That's a completely different side of Jeff than wrestling fans usually saw. And then naming TNA, I think that was kind of ingenious. Total nonstop action. First time I read it, just like everybody else, yeah, tits and ass. That's what was thought of. So, but it was a great marketing ploy. And let's be honest, everybody knew exactly what the initials meant. And they absolutely leaned into it, that's for sure. This wasn't the PG era yet. WWE had just entered the Ruthless Aggression, and right after the Attitude Era, and TNA wanted to stand out immediately. So total nonstop action told the fans this was going to push the envelope a little bit more than they've been watching on WWE TV. First show, the first pay-per-view, they're doing weekly pay-per-views for $9.95. And that's another kind of ingenious thing because WWE's doing pay-per-views and the UFC's doing pay-per-views, and they're $49.95, stuff like that, sometimes more. And, they decide to do $9.95 a month for 4 shows, maybe 5 in the month if there's a fifth Wednesdays. They were doing those on Wednesdays. And it was coming in cheaper than the monthly WWE pay-per-views, that was for sure. So, kind of made sense. And you know, if you ever worked on live TV, them mentioning that ring breaking right before they're about to go live, yeah, that's not good. So, and I remember purchasing one of those pay per views, maybe two, just to kind of see what it was all about. And it impressed me, but it didn't impress me enough to continue because I kind of figured, and I think they were talking about it in the dirt sheets and stuff, and they were eventually probably going to be getting television, and I thought I'd just kind of wait for that. So, and then Jeff had the X division and explains why. It wasn't just cruiserweights. It wasn't a weight class. It was just if you can go, you wrestle. And they had those X matches with the cables across the top, and instead of the usual ladder match, and those were pretty cool to see. So, and kind of the X division kind of came one of TNA's greatest contributions to wrestling up to a certain point, as long as it's not the train wrecks. There's some great X division matches out there, and there's kind of train wrecks, and we kind of see an extension of those train wrecks in AEW nowadays with some of the stuff that they do. So, and then our old buddy Vince Russo arrives. Oh, boy, have I got concerns. I never have liked him. Hold on, I'll tell you about that in just a second. But Russo wanted chaos, and it wasn't just a wrestling show anymore. And this is where we kind of start seeing the fault lines. Everyone wanted TNA. Nobody agreed what TNA actually was. And, there was no real center to TNA because now you had competing philosophies going on in that time. So, and what in the blue hell was Jeff thinking bringing on Vince Russo? I'm sorry. I mean, I love the guy, I respect the guy, but no. Look what he did in WCW. He was out of control. And when he first got to WCW, I kind of liked what he was doing, but he was kind of giving, getting the younger guys more exposure and stuff. And I thought that was cool because some of those younger guys I kind of knew, or, like Mike Awesome, I knew, but then I saw what he was doing with Mike. So I had concerns with that way back then. Anyway, but over time, it just became too chaotic, and he was booking, and he was in there, and he's putting himself over. And then he had, what's his face? Somebody put in the comments who he is, mimicking Jim Ross and his Bell palsy, playing Oklahoma. And didn't Russo put himself over as the world champion also? So, see, that's not professional wrestling that I grew up and loved. So I wasn't even watching during that time. I felt so bad for Mike Awesome, who I used to work with at ringside, and before he went to Japan, and hopefully help give him some teachings and helped him out somewhat. He'd do stuff, and afterwards we talk about things. He asked for my advice, stuff like that. But anyway, I found myself asking, I don't know, was that the right move? Enough about that. But Russo versus Jerry, different philosophies, different generations, different wrestling, and Jeff was kind of caught in the middle. And could anyone have successfully balanced those two personalities? I don't think so. Well, let's see here. Well, the documentary. Okay, I get worked up about that now. Losing track of what I'm trying to say, but the documentary it keeps showing the same pattern of Owen and Jerry, and we'll see about Jill and the tragedies. And Jeff kind of buries himself in work instead of grieving, and that's kind of a theme that we're seeing in this. One of my biggest concerns is that TNA Wrestling had financial problems, creative disagreements, and leadership fractures just in the first few years. And, we're going to get into this a little bit more. This was the story of how Jeff Jarrett became the man who created TNA and all the personal and business struggles that shaped both him and the company. And I didn't. I split this up into two parts because it was a 2-hour show and I didn't want to talk too long in this episode of mine. So until next time, just remember, Gene has concerns.